previous session and now back into this session, so welcome. You are in for such a treat. I saw these three guys last year and it was absolutely fantastic, so thank you for coming in and keeping us company in this room. So introducing Martyn, Linton, Lennox Rodgers and Professor Chinn. Please put your hands together.
Hello. Thank you for joining us at this session here at Crimecon. The session is called Inside the Mind of a Violent Gang Member, and what we're going to do over the next sort of 45 minutes is look at the origin, if you like, of violence and organised crime, move that through into the current day, and Lennox, who I'm going to let introduce in a second himself, he's going to talk a bit about his journey as a gang member and what he does now. And then at the end, I'm sure there's going to be some questions. I'm going to throw it open to you all, and you can ask what you want. We've had a conversation amongst ourselves, and the broad attitude is that there's no question that can't be asked really. If there's something that's so raw, we won't answer it, but it tends to be sort of a, ask what you want. Inside the mind, if there's a question you've got to ask, then please ask. So I'll start with my left. Carl, introduce yourself first, please.
Thank you very much. I always get a bit worried when I get a round of applause before I've opened my mouth. So thank you for that. My name's Chinn. I am a professor of history, but I prefer to be called Carl. My focus in history has been really based upon the family that I come from. I'm fortunate I grew up better off. My dad was an illegal bookmaker, so was my granddad. But my mum and dad were both from very tough parts of Birmingham. My mum was from Aston, dad from Starkbrook, and they instilled in me a strong bond of belief of the streets they came from. Mum came from a street where I worked out in about 1947 out of 400 people in the street, 38 were aunts, uncles and first cousins to mum. In my dad's street, they were also very tightly intimate with 3 other families, and there was this great sense of kinship and neighbours, as well as hardship. So it's about getting the balance right between looking and understanding the positives that come out when a community is faced with hardship and is under stress, but also recognising the negatives. So my whole belief has been really about letting people, talking to people from poorer backgrounds and allowing them to speak, and also to try and, if possible, push on to politicians some aspects of what we can learn from the past. There are no exact lessons that we can learn from the past, because the context of time and place changes. But we've just been chatting, myself, Martyn and Lennox, and one of the things I think that I just wish politicians would listen to is invest in poorer neighbourhoods, invest in youth. Let's find things for youngsters to do, and later on, perhaps we'll talk about the origins of gangs in the 19th century. I can expand on one of the reasons why they declined, the backstreet gangs, was socially concerned clergymen and women opening up what we now call youth clubs. So my whole life really has been very much, my working life has been about loyalty to the people I come from, to the people who've given me an opportunity. I'm the first one in my family to go past 15 at school, the first one to take O-levels, A-levels, go to university. I'm the lucky one. I owe a duty to those that allow me to do that, and that's really my whole belief in my background influences my whole belief in my history.
No, well, there's a lot going on there. Lennox, over to you, please.
Yeah, I'm from I'm from Oxford, and I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I grew up around gangs, and there were like skinhead gangs, mods, you know, every area had gangs. And when I went to school, it was a lot of racism, because they still had signs on the windows of guest houses and places: no blacks, no Indians, no Irish, no dogs, no Chinese. And so I saw a lot of that. And at my school, a student would stand in the middle of the playground and shout blacks against whites, and you know, the teachers would be in the classrooms looking out the windows, placing bets, and there'd be a big tear up against, you know, about 7 or 8 of us that were from mixed backgrounds. And yeah, so I grew up in that, was sexually abused from the age of 7 or 8 to the age of 12, 13, and groomed to be a pimp at the age of 14. I kicked out of every school, ended up in an approved school. It was like St Trinian's for boys, and ended up in 2 gangs. One was a drug dealing gang, and I was an enforcer, and the other gang was organised crime in London, which was a big eye-opener. But yeah, so my background, you know, having that, you know, the abuse and the rape, you know, sort of created a rage in me. So when I did my violence, that's what came out. But now I'm able to use that lived experience to help young people today. They tell me that that I know what it's like. You know, I've worked in children's prison and everything. I work in the community. I rescue a lot of children that have been caught up in gangs and stuff, and yeah, help them come out of it and live normal lives.
And I've been following your work for some time, and you've gained some really good sort of much deserved recognition for that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but thank you for that. So my background, I was, well, there's no way of sugarcoating it. As a youth, I was a member of a street gang up in the West Midlands, and things started to go silly. I never got in as ingrained as Lennox did, because there was some well-timed interventions by certain agencies. Sadly, there was something I don't like to talk about, but basically somebody ended up losing their life one night. I wasn't there because on this rare occasion I decided to stay home and watch TV with my mum, which never happened. To the point my mum would say, this never happens. And then it's only because I've gone out and been smashed the night before, because I've been up to no good. But I would go missing for periods of 2 or 3 days, sitting, we call them crack dens, but it wasn't crack there, it's more the weed being smoked and stuff. But I was called out before I started to get involved with anything, you know, that would see me go to prison. And then I turned the ultimate traitor, because years later I became a police officer, and that didn't go down very well. As a detective, I've investigated gang crime, I've investigated murder in the street, and now I'm sort of more involved in the human trafficking world and the organised immigration stuff, so like the people smuggling and whatever. So I've seen both sides of that fence. So I think that's enough really, that's a flavour for who we are. So Carl, if I may turn to you, please. Well, nice open question really then. I appreciate that obviously this has been a subject going on for sort of hundreds of years, but what would you say was the key sort of starting point that's led to where we are today?
I think I want to pick up first of all on what Lennox has talked about, how much it takes to come out and speak so openly as he's done, because it's people like Lennox and Martyn who have been there and understand what's happening on the street. And I really congratulate you and admire the work that you're doing, Lennox, and you, Martyn. I was never in a gang as such, but growing up like Lennox in the 60s and 70s, I'm a Villa fan, we go to away matches. There was fighting everywhere. There was fighting everywhere. Just see the size of it.
My nan would like you, but for my family, it was always Birmingham City or Villa, and if you were a real tearaway, you'd be a Wolves fan.
So there was, you know, the fighting, you ran away to football matches. I suppose me and my best mate, we were just on the edge, right on the edge. Back then, and again I think Lennox will understand this, if you went to a pub in a different area and the local mob was there, you had to be careful, or you had to leave probably quick. So I was always kind of on the outside, and I always had this fear that I was physical, but I come from a very strong family who were fighters, not bullies, and I want to make that very clear. So there was fighters, boxers on both sides. So that what I'm leading into there is this idea of masculinity. And without making any excuses, in what I found in my research, looking at the origins of the real Peaky Blinder gangs, who were not glamorous gangsters, but vicious fire and violence, was that I wanted to understand where did they come from. And I think we need to understand the demography in the mid-19th century. It's a younger population, and lots of young men under 30. And they're working 6 days a week, and they're gathering on wastelands on a Sunday, the Lord's Day, and the middle class don't like this, and they're gambling, and they're playing rough games, really rough games, and the police are forced to act against them. That's what I found started the gangs in the back streets of Birmingham. I think it's very similar in Manchester and Salford. Andy Davis's work there would show the same phenomenon. It was part of this idea that the poor of the street, actually, it belonged to you. And in a world, again, without making excuses and making up a lack of culpability, in a world where poorer working class men had nothing, the one thing that they had was their street. And that belonged to them, and that was, our street was harder than your street. So you talk to a lot of older people in Birmingham, they don't say they come from a street, they say they come out of the street. And they talk about the street almost like a very tough woman who it's theirs. And that's bound up by the kinship networks I was talking about earlier on, which were relevant to my family. And so you get drawn in. The street then, the gangs emerge, they're street gangs. And they hate the police, they bait the police, that's the term they use. They battle each other, one street against the next. What one gang war in Birmingham went on between Park Street, which Selfridges now overlooks, and Milk Street, just 4 streets away. Went on for 40 years, on and off. A couple of people were killed in it with knife-ins. So it's that idea of identity, masculinity, hardness, and fighting against the police as well as an organisation that was being forced to crack down on what poorer people saw as their street life. Because they had no gardens, there was no parks, there's no recreation grounds, there's no facilities for people to enjoy themselves. So the gangs emerged in Birmingham. There were always hard men and nasty men and groups, but the cities with the worst rampant backstreet gang problem was Birmingham, with originally they were called sluggers, then Peaky Blinders in the 1860s, late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, to just before the First World War. There were no Peaky Blinders in the 20s like the series. There were men who had been Peaky Blinders, but they were all in their 40s and 50s if they hadn't been killed in the First World War. In Manchester and Salford, there were the Scotlanders. In London, there were backstreet gangs around Clerkenwell, Hoxton in particular, Bethnal Green, Whitechapel, Elephant and Castle in South London, Walworth, Bermondsey. From 1898, a new term comes into the English language of a rowdy and violent bank holiday August weekend. The word hooligan is used for the first time. So in effect, the backstreet gangs of London became known as hooligans. There were the Scotlanders of Manchester and Salford. There was the Peaky Blinders and Sloggers of Birmingham. There were numerous backstreet gangs in Glasgow, which were often tied into sectarianism, Protestants against Catholic, and vice versa. There were some small gangs in Sheffield. There was the Mooney Gang and the Garvey Gang. But Sheffield and Leeds and the other big cities did not have the rampant gang backstreet problem that Birmingham, Manchester, Salford, and much of North, East and South London had.
Okay, so that obviously that in that sort of time there. So what would you say? We've spoken about people not having a lot and they had their street. What about the individuals that sort of came to becoming that? Is there any more factors that you would sort of say?
Yeah, I don't know what is the correct term to use. But what I'll use an example from my own family. My great-grandfather, Edward Derrick, was a real Peaky Blinder. He was 5'4"1/4". He was a petty thief. He, on one occasion, attacked a man with a shovel. When that didn't work, he picked up a meat cleaver and cleaved it into his head. Luckily, the man didn't die. He got sent down for 3 years. But the worst thing he regularly did was he abused my great-grandmother. And I'd heard this story told to me by people from my dad's street, how my great-grandmother used to have to run and hide when he was coming home drunk. He would smash the house up, he would beat her up. They used to have what was called in Birmingham a brewers, a communal wash house. She'd hide in there, a little brick building outside. I found the divorce papers later. I didn't think she could have got a divorce. We were told she divorced her. How could a poor woman get a divorce? But she got the divorce. I found them on the National Archives as a poor woman. And she couldn't read or write. She had to sign a name. And it was very upsetting reading the legalistic descriptions of what the older people had told me. That he had smashed up the house, he was violent. So why was he like that? Now my dad's grandfather, they were tough, they were fighting, but this is where I think there's a major difference. All of my family on all sides, apart from the Derricks, had strong women, strong role models, female role models in the family. Edward Derrick came from a family where his dad also abused his mum. His grandparents were imprisoned. His father and his brothers were separated in the workhouse. So I'm not saying this is the same for every family, but it's turning, you know, think of what Lennox said about what happened to you, Lennox, growing up, is that for a lot of young men and women, but particularly we talk about gangs and young men, something happens in their childhood and youth. For me, the lack of a very strong female role model is really, really something that I would value. Also, of a family that, whilst might be tough, had rules and regulations and beliefs in a certain way of fighting fairly. Edward Derrick had none of those things. Nor did his brother was the leader of the local gang in Sparkbrook where my dad was from.
I'm with you. So it's interesting, you said the lack of a female role model there, and a term you quite often hear now is the term absent father. Yes, predominantly we're talking about young lads, aren't we, in gangs these days, and the father figure is absolutely there, but I sometimes get when I'm delivering training sessions with professionals, I prefer the term absent parent, because for me, okay, I'm fortunate in as much as both my parents are still alive, but there was stuff that I would tell my mum that I daren't tell my dad, and vice versa. So the term absent parent sits better with me, because you can't just sort of say one's more important than that when you're raising someone. But Lennox, if I could just turn to you, so could you just sort of run through the flavour as to how things are in the current day in terms of, you know, how gangs are operating and how people get involved?
Well, a lot of the gangs that I've come across have been targeting young people. They have seen that, you know, young people are able to be used to take risks that they don't need to take. I once talked to a gang, to a gang of kids who were involved in county lines, and I said to them, what's the difference between your gang leaders and paedophiles? And they thought for a while, and they said, do you know what, there's no difference, but we'd rather be with the gangs than the paedophiles. But, you know, they said there's not really a lot of difference. And, you know, especially in today's climate, young people are willing to do anything for money. You know, I go into schools and I do workshops and I hold up some money. Who wants to earn £100, and everyone puts their hand up. I show them a bag of drugs. I say, all you've got to do is look after this for 10 minutes, and they still want it. I said, but right, you're going to have to hide these drugs on you and everything, and a lot of the kids don't care. You know, they want the money, and the gangs have been through that themselves, and so they know how to tempt the kids. They know that some kids, you know, are the breadwinners. You know, they you know, do these things, and some parents condone it. You know, because there's not a father figure, and you know, They put like 5 bills on the table, 500 quid, or and a kid does that today. They're not going to get grassed up or anything. Especially with fuel prices and paying the bills. Yeah, so.
I think it's really interesting what Leg said, because drugs has changed. If we compare the street gangs I was researching in the 19th, early 20th centuries, drugs and money have changed things.
Yes.
And the gangs that I was right about, the real Peaky ones, they're territorial. They're fighting each other. They're fighting the police. They might go into a pub and demand 7 or 8 pints for free and smash the pub if they don't get it. One of the worst gangsters supposedly in the East End was Dodger Mullins, and that was basically what he did in Bethnal Green.
That's not going to be you later, is it?
No, not me later.
No, just checking.
But what happens is the money comes in with a few, and this is where the organised crimes start, and it's really interesting what Lennox is saying, because some of the worst Peaky Blinders, particularly, I don't know, how many of you seen the series, right? You remember the gangster getting killed at the end of series 1, Billy Kimber? He portrayed as a small cockney. He was a big burly brummy. And he had been a Peaky Blinder. And he's the first major organised gang leader in England. The real Derby Sabine was from Clerkenwell in North London. The real Alfie Solomon was actually from Covent Garden. And so they moved from the street gangs. This is where they emerged, not so much Solomon, but Sabini with an Anglo-Italian gang, Billy Kimber with the Peaky Blinders. They move, a few of them, into blackmailing bookmakers and extorting protection money from them. Then in Soho, nightclubs, Spielers, illegal gambling clubs. So those would be the ones that would be similar to the gangs that you're talking about now.
It's all about the money, and I can tell you from personal experience, arresting people is an occupational hazard to these people, particularly if they're part of an inquisitive crime gang. Going to prison particularly doesn't bother someone. I've seen some recruitment techniques where it's, earn now, save for tomorrow. You might do a little bit of time. But what really hurts these people is, and I've had great satisfaction with this, is when a tow truck pulls up to take their BMW away, or their house is being boarded up because it's going to be put up for auction, or whatever. And that's the nature of organised crime at the minute. Lennox, you've obviously got a very powerful story which you share with people, and how you got into a gang. Can you sort of take us through that? Just pick out, whatever you're comfortable speaking about, and just sort of talk to us as to how your journey progressed.
My journey progressed through a lot of violence. I was getting into a lot of fights, and at the early stages, everybody fought with their fists, apart from these gangs. We called them boot boys, and they would come out with weapons, or football firms. In my area, it was like Millwall and Oxford.
Birmingham City.
But so I got known for violence. I was getting beaten a lot. I had a lot of domestic violence at home. My dad would beat me with the belt and the buckle of the belt. I got beat with all sorts, and I took that onto the streets. And sometimes it was hard to get away from these gangs, and I used to take my belt off in the same way my dad used to beat me. And but I got beaten up a lot from the gangs, and as I got older, gangs tried to recruit me. So the drug dealing gang I was part of, they wanted to use me as an enforcer, because their guys were having a lot of problems protecting their product, and they were faced with competition, a bit territorial in the area for selling drugs. So they headhunted me, and so I was recruited in a different way than some of the young people are today. And then I was similarly headhunted by an organised crime gang in London, and I used to go to a pub, and criminals called it the labour exchange, because you'd come out of prison, you go to the labour exchange, and you can get a job. You could find out what house to burgle, or what place to rob and stuff like that, and so that's why it was the labour exchange. And there was a guy there from this organised crime gang, and he took me to London and introduced me to professionals, bankers, business people. There was East End gangsters in it, there was solicitors, there was police, there was MPs, and you know, it made me look at where I come from and think, right, we're just thugs. Compared to these, you know. And my mentor and the jewellery shop and was chauffeur driven, you know. And so because of the type of violence, I stabbed people. You know, I didn't always mean for it to happen the way it did, but because of the seriousness of the violence, like this guy got me locked up for breaking up the fight between a friend of mine and him, and because my friend was white and he's black, he thought that I dissed him because I should have stuck with the black guy, and I said no, I don't operate like that, and so he lied to the police, and I got prosecuted, put in prison, and during the time in prison my father died, so me and him fell out. When I saw him, I went to punch him in the face with a knife in my hand, and the force was so hard that the knife broke in his face, and I was left with like the handle and a bit of the blade in my hand, and I just really attacked him. I bounced his head off the pavement and everything. Luckily he didn't die, but the rage came out. And so I had a lot of violence like that. You know, someone else ripped me off. You know, we were supposed to rob the race, the dog race stadium, and he kept letting me down and costing us money and time and that. And then when I went to see him about it, he you know, used to, because he was doing drugs himself, he used to think it was nothing and he used to buoy me off, sort of thing. I took out I had a mini Rambo knife. I went to punch him with it. It went through his underneath his mouth. It nearly come out the other side of his head. And I did all this whilst I had a taxi waiting. I was like, I was just on another planet in my head with the violence. I thought I was doing what was right, yeah. So I was known for violence, and people started to see me as fearless.
So, what would you say was the trigger to that? I mean, what made you so angry? Or why do you think? I suppose what I'm trying to get across is. Why do people use? Because obviously that's a high level of violence that you've just been describing there. But what sort of goes through someone's mind when you think that that rage is there? Try and talk me through that if you can.
Injustice is what they've done, what they did to me, and the way my head used to work at the time, I used to replay what I would do in my head, and you know, because I didn't have any fighting training. Only through school. I mean, I boxed all over Hampshire and everything like that, and you don't know what you're up against sometimes. But I used to feel that I've done a wrong, and the only way that I was going to be able to put it right. Because it couldn't be sorted out any other way. They weren't. didn't take you seriously. And
Yeah.
I was tired of people treating me bad. People used to call me names, and at one stage for a while I used to have to take it all, but I couldn't take it anymore.
So how, the current day, so obviously the current violence we see all the time now, predominantly young people on the street, what's your views on that side of it?
You know, they're fueled by, you know, these young people today, they're carrying a lot of baggage too, you know, and the violence that they've, you know, the experiences that they've endured fuels, you know, some of what they do, but also there's an expectation in the gangs they're in that you've got to defend the product, you know, and if you see, if you're part of one gang and you see members of another gang, it's expected of you to have a fight, you know. It's like that, but drug dealers are always contacting other drug dealers and arranging for drugs, and then there's a gang of lads waiting to rob them. You know, but all the while, the young people are carrying, you know, abuses, you know, no father figure, all sorts of baggage, you know, loved ones that have died, like grandparents, and they were connected to, and you know, they haven't had any help with all that, and they're carrying a lot of anger and rage, and the gangs know this because they got it themselves.
They prey on vulnerable people, don't they? So, I'm going to come back to you. So, obviously, Lennox has just given us a sort of snapshot. We could talk about this for a week. It's such a wide subject, but obviously time's not with us. But Lennox is obviously talking about how things are sort of in the current day. But in my view, nothing's really changed. It's still the same things, isn't it, from years ago?
I think there's interesting overlaps with what Lennox was talking about. You developed the main weapon of the Peaky Blinders, the main weapons of the Scots was their buckle belts. They would take them off in a fight. They would wrap them. Was that the same with you? Wrap it around your wrist?
Or string them round.
Yeah. So they would wrap it around their wrist and leave about 10 inches, and then they'd put it between the thumb and forefinger across the palm and leave about 8 inches, which would be buckled. Now these are the old, we remember these belts, thick little belts with heavy brass buckles. They have cause terrible injuries. So there's that sense there still of territoriality, but now on a different level because of the money involved. And I think that's again coming back to the origins of the gang, organised gangs. They emerge from the street gangs just as the drug gangs have emerged from street gangs, but it goes to a different level.
Yeah.
Billy Kimber had 2 families. He abandoned his Birmingham wife to live in dire poverty. She was buried in a pauper's grave. His second family, his 2 daughters, had an education and finishing schools in Switzerland, had ponies, and they had cruises to South Africa in the 1930s. His 2 Birmingham girls lived in poverty. The one passed on to her family. This is coming back again to what Lennox was talking about in you, Martyn. She passed on to her descendants. She says, you crossed our dad, Billy Crimber, you paid with their life, because if you owed him money, you were dead. And it's the money that changed.
It very much
It's
is.
the money that changed it. So you still have that territoriality. There's still, you know, the postcode gangs in Birmingham, in Manchester, in London, but the drugs and the money is now another level.
I think the principles as to why people join and the fact that it hasn't changed over hundreds of years.
No.
I think the tactics have changed. So if you look at cross-border drug supply, you had the yardies who would exploit predominantly pregnant women, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Swallowing packages and flying into the country. Now, when you look at drug supply, there's this increased focus now, the tactic of exploiting children. So gangs are gangs. Gangs have always been gangs for what they are. I think we all agree there. But it's the tactics and the methods that are now used that have altered over the time.
It's also interesting you mentioned the Yardies there, that the 2 most notorious gangs in Birmingham really since the late 80s are the Burger Boys and the Johnson crew.
Yeah.
They emerged in response to the Yardies coming over from Kingston, beating up local black kids, and then
Absolutely.
The local youngsters got together and actually threw the yard out. Now, it's still happening this last week. There's been 6 members of offshoots of the Burger Boys and the Johnson crew, men in their 30s, sent down or for a serious fight in a non-club.
No, it's been going on for years, and obviously I was born there. But what I'm going to do, before we do a Q&A session, because I know people tend to get up to go and get good seats at the next slide, I'm going to highlight Lennox and Carl are both authors of books. They're going to be doing a book signing straight after this event. I've read Lennox's books. I've bought Carl's books, they're on a pile, and I'm going to get to them, but my better half is here, and I've got more books than sense at the minute, so I'll go and get rid of some. But do buy the books, there's a lot more detail in these. Lennox goes into some serious detail as to stuff that's gone on in his life, and I actually made a confession to him last night over a pint that a lot of what he went through here is very similar to my childhood, and I'm not going to go into what because I'm not ready to, but some of the stuff that he put in here and stuff he went through with his therapist in jail and whatever has actually helped me. So I'm going to say thank you again, Lennox. Keep writing. But they'll be signing books straight after here in the book signing group. For me, I haven't written a book because there's some, how can I put it, some complications with my current employment. So I will see how that goes. But I do training with professionals. I'll be in a book signing room afterwards if anyone wants to come and grab one of my business cards and look at doing one of my online courses as to why people join gangs and stuff to get a better understanding. You're more than welcome to do that. Right, so we've got probably, 6 or 7 minutes left. I'm going to throw it open to everyone here to basically ask any questions you want to.
Hello, this is working. Okay, I don't mean to be over the top, but I think this has been one of the best sessions of the day.
Thank you very much.
Can I cheat and perhaps ask 2 questions? Lennox seems so chilled out now. How do we make the transition from, all that rage and all that pain and that kind of thing to somebody who almost like a Buddhist monk,
No, he's not.
And then the second show, I've forgotten the Peaky Blinders, Carl. You mentioned that certain areas geographically have, didn't get into the sort of culture of gangs, so like Leeds and Sheffield. What do you think? What factors do you think change that? And how do you think that could be applied to modern day? Because from my knowledge, where I come from, in Ipswich, I don't remember historically there being an issue of gangs, but because of what they call it, county lines, it's getting really silly. You've got one estate versus the other, and what I personally think actually is most with Big Boss is in a nice 6-bedroom thing. He's most probably playing them off against each other.
It's probably a flat in North London from experience. But Lennox, if you want to deal with that half first.
I would say read the book.
It's a really good question about why there wasn't the rampant backstreet gangsters in the other cities. There were gangs. There was a terrible gang war in Sheffield in the 1920s, but it was actually a civil war within, if I can use that phrase, within one gang. There were horrible men, little gangs in every place, even in small villages. But you didn't have the rampant ruffianism that Birmingham, Manchester, Salford, Liverpool, Glasgow had. Whether it's because those cities were much bigger and that they had really extensive poorer working class neighbourhoods. And I do want to make this point, just because somebody's poor doesn't make them a criminal. No. Because the vast majority of poorer people, they're the ones that are preyed upon by the criminals. And I wish, again, politicians would realise that it's the poor that are in the fighting line all the time. But poverty does have an effect, there's no doubt about it. It's a question I can't really answer because I still need to do more research on that, which is a great question.
Down the front here, there's a couple of questions.
And the lady at the back. Hello.
Hey, that's me, I think. Hi. There we go. Nope.
What we'll do,
I'm not the lady down the front.
No, that's right. We'll deal with yours. What we'll do, if you do yours, then we do the sort of front lady at the back, but we'll have to get through them, so time's against us, so...
Cool. Carl, Martyn, Lennox, thank you so much. It's been amazing to hear your story. Lennox, I'm sorry to hear your story. It's a bad one. Modern day gangs, I'm kind of curious because you read a lot of papers about postcode wars, that sort of thing. What we receive by reading the papers, no motivation. It just seems to be random violence based on postcodes. Is the motivation with postcode gangs the same? Could you demystify that?
It's probably got, I'm going to give you a really short answer because I want to get to the other questions. Predominantly at the moment, it's going to be down to territory over drugs or money.
Yeah.
This is my corner, this is where I sell. And because they can't access the courts to settle their disputes, they go for dominance. So it will be who can do the most violence. And if you start looking at organisations such as the Mexican Mafia and the cartels, they would burn people on stacks with burnt car tyres around them as a symbol.
So it's the same principle.
It's the same sort of principle, and it's about...
Well, I think it starts again, there's that overlap between the territoriality that we're sticking up for our neighbourhood as well as
the acquisitive.
making a gap. So it's that joining together now, at that point you made, acquisitive crime with territoriality. So.
I'll just shout out my question. This is to you, Martyn. First of all, amazing talk. You said before that it was seen as betrayal from the background you came from to become a police officer. So my question is, did you bump into any of your ex-associates? And so how?
Right, so I got a two-prong. First of all, I'm black, so I shouldn't join the police. You'd be surprised, and I've had more racism off of black people as a uniformed officer walking around North London than I have anyone else. It's a fact. It's not a fact that many people like to hear. So I had that, but then because I joined the police, so. One example, short answer is yes. I buried my auntie a few years ago, just before COVID, and I'm in a pub with my dad, minding my own business, and some people from my past appeared. I nearly had to punch my way out of the pub, but I dealt with it, but then the phones came out, some text messages started being sent, and I don't know who was getting text. So I just made my excuse and disappeared. But it's not a popular decision. Chris, and then the lady at the back of them will be nicely on time.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about social media. I'll cover a lot of court cases at the Old Bailey, and there's one at the moment actually where we should be getting a verdict quite soon involving a famous war between Stonebridge and Church Street, Church Road soldiers, northwest of Brent gangs, and it's been going on for years. But the current one is there's a lot of involvement in YouTube videos, rappers. There's two particular rappers, one from each gang, who are they made songs sort of dissing each other, and then you have murders.
Directly linked.
Do you think that social media, YouTube, etc., carry some of the blame?
Yes. Social media is a massive pain in the backside, and often you'll get, take this from me as someone who's actively investigating this sort of crime. They're very slow to react, they don't filter, and certain ones, which I won't mention, as a detective you can say, I want some information on an account. Yeah, that's fine, but in 48 hours we're going to tell you can't hold any access, because in US law that's what we have to do. Yeah, great. If I'm looking at someone's social media account for a gang-related drug supply or an attempt murder, I really don't want them knowing. So social media is a big problem, and they don't help at all.
Very quick on that as well. Social media definitely, not that I don't understand it, but violent pornography as well.
Yeah.
Because it dehumanises too often women.
Yeah.
And there's a real issue there that we've got to get young men who've got these violent backgrounds to respect women. It's a massive problem we've got to cross.
And they do mistreat women.
Yeah, and it's not
massively.
just...
And film it as well.
Yeah.
Film it all
Yeah.
the time.
So for me, coming from a background where I come from a long line of, I'm not a woman obviously, but a long line of strong women in my families, I feel very, very angry as a father, a son, a husband, that women are faced and continually abused, and it's scared for women to work around and say, I'm appalled as a man. I'm disgusted.
Right, we go. Last question, because we're right on time, and then otherwise I'll be throwing us out.
Croydon Youth Offending Service. I come across many young people with carrying knives, and to them it is as important as their phones. They don't leave their houses without it.
My keys, my phone, my knife.
Yeah, exactly. And of course they're readily available on social media. That really serves nice. Do you have a solution on how we can tackle this?
Oh, there's a question. Why don't we get that one before we right, very short, and maybe grab me afterwards if you want more. It's a multi-agency thing. No single agency is going to deal with this on their own. It's pointless just saying to the cops, what are you doing about it? If we're not doing anything to tackle the anger, if we're not dealing with the community issues that bring this along, and we're not dealing with policing plays a very important part of that. Because you've got to look at, you can't just lock everybody up for carrying a knife, you've got to look at the root causes. And I've had that with 9-year-olds outside of London, let's just put it that way, who've taken a knife to school from really good families because they're scared. It needs a really big investment, a multi-agency tackling approach, not just locking everybody up. There's got to be a health element to that, the public health you hear. Everybody's got to join up working, and I'm conscious that I'm giving you a bit of a politician's answer here. There's no simple solution to it. So me personally, no, I can't give you this is what you need to do to end the problem. It needs tackling from so many different angles.
And very quickly on the historical angle, that would sustain exactly what you're saying. The reason that the Peaky blinders, the Scots disappeared, yes, there was stronger policing. The police had to be strong because there was fighting. There was strong sensitive, but at the same time in Birmingham, Rafter, who was the chief constable, brought in the first child probation officers, policemen who were looking after young children that were going to be in danger during gangs, and socially concerned clergymen and women were opening up football clubs. Aston Villa, Birmingham City, Manchester City, Everton, all started from churches. And they opened up boxing clubs in the East End, in a very tough park called the Nickel in Bethnal Green. Father J opened up a rudimentary boxing club. Father Pinchard did the same in the very poor parts of Birmingham. You get football becomes a major participatory game. So it's and this wasn't planned, it was all organic. But now, surely to God, we've got the ability to plan it.
It's those above us. I'm not going to get into that conversation. But
very good.
Thank you very much for your time today. Ask any more questions you want in the book signing room. And if they do invite us back next year, it'll be good to see.
Which we will.
Oh, well, there you go. I'll put it in my diary now. Thank you very much.